All right now, Tom Clougherty is with us here in Washington. He's the editorial director at the Cato Institute Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. Bidisha focuses on international affairs as a London-based writer and commentator. And joining us from New York is George Szamuely. He's a senior research fellow with London Metropolitan University's Global Policy Institute. Thanks to all of you for joining us. George, the Brexit negotiations have reached a new phase. And the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, has outlined in broadly what Britain wants. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
We will be beginning the talks about our future relationship. We'll be beginning those straight away, and also talking about the implementation period that will give certainty to businesses and individuals. We're leaving the European Union on the 29th of March 2019. We will set up and negotiate a new trade deal with the European Union, but also we'll be negotiating trade deals with other countries around the world. This is about building a Britain that is fit for the future.
So, George, Ms May wants a deal that is tailored to Britain's needs, a so-called bespoke agreement, but the EU's main negotiator, Michel Barnier, says that may not be possible. How difficult a hurdle is this to get over?
Well, it's a great hurdle because everything really is still to play for, because it's very unclear what the final deal is likely to be. Ideally, there will be some kind of a so-called soft Brexit whereby Britain will still be part of the internal market, still part of the same customs union. But that may not be possible, and there is considerable political opposition within the Theresa May's Conservative Party to that. And then if there is, however, a hard Brexit, which is also possible, then there could be very serious repercussions. And indeed, there may not be any kind of a deal at all, in which case it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Britain remains in the EU. So everything is still to play for.
What would be the circumstances where that would happen, where Britain remains in the EU? You mean it will still be subject to the obligations of the EU? It would still enjoy all the privileges of membership?
Well, that would happen if there is no agreement reached. I mean, keep in mind, there is a really very tight deadline. I mean, we're talking about March 2019, so there isn't really that much time. And if there is no agreement, or if Theresa May does reach an agreement, but it's rejected by Parliament, then we're back to status quo ante. Now, in those circumstances, I mean, Barnier has said, oh, well, there's no option of Britain remaining in the EU unless all of the EU member states agree to it. But that's quite a possibility, because I don't think any country within the EU actually wants to see Britain leave. So if there is no deal, or if the British Parliament rejects any kind of a deal, then it's quite possible that every other European country say, well, okay, if Britain has changed its mind, wants to stay in, well, fine, let Britain stay in.
Bidisha, what are your thoughts on that? It would be quite remarkable if Britain ends up staying in the EU by default.
Well, I am a passionate Remainer, and in fact, that is my secret wish. I would absolutely second and follow on from what the previous speaker said. The state that we're in at the moment is one of intense insecurity and not anxiety, but doubtfulness about the future. And that is not just political, it's not just economic, so it's not just about multiple business leaders doing their own research and saying, look, every possible option post-Brexit is worse than the status quo as it is now. But it's also sociological. I do think, as a non-white Briton, that the country that I grew up in and that I had recognized, people in it are now asking, well, what does Britain stand for? Does it stand for being part of a world community, which is not just a technical thing, it's also symbolic? Or does it turn more inward? Does it see itself as this lone state, which is somehow free in an idealistic way to have all these trade deals and relationships with other countries, even though the technical reality of that is very difficult to negotiate? So it's a really unsettling time, and it's worrying at multiple levels, not just technical or technological levels. It's an identity crisis, and we're seeing that play out in terms of concern, but also in terms of some very ugly, nationalistic, nativistic, colorist notions.
Tom, the European Union chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, is taking a pretty tough line with the British. You know, when the British talk about a bespoke deal, he sees it as Britain trying to cherry-pick what it wants in some kind of future trade deal, and he says, in his words, Britain must face the consequences of Brexit. Is this some kind of negotiating tactic to play hardball here, or is this what I think the European position?
It's partly a negotiating tactic. It's partly a statement of reality. I mean, I think that even the most fervent Brexiteer would have realized that there was no way the European Union would agree to us having every single benefit of European Union membership without any of the corresponding responsibilities. That was never on the table, and I think Michel Barnier is just reminding us of that. However, I think that while there is clearly always the possibility that things will change course and that in the end Britain might decide to remain, I see it as an extremely outside possibility. Contrary to what the previous guests have said, I think it would be extremely unlikely that things would get to that. Look, I think what we're going to have is, starting next year, we'll begin talking about that transition period. The schedule seems to be that by the autumn of next year, Britain and the European Union will have agreed a sort of status quo period of 2 years where nothing much will change, although Britain will technically stop being a European Union member. They'll also agree during that period next year a framework for the future relationship. I think broad principles of what the future trade deal might look like. And then once Britain leaves, once that transition period begins, the formal technical talks of putting that deal together will begin. And I think it will end up being a bespoke deal. My own view was that Britain could very easily, immediately after Brexit, have said, we're going to go for the so-called Norway option. We'll stay in the single market, but we'll leave the customs union so we can trade more freely with other countries. There were gains to be had there, and quite quickly. I think because a large part of the British electorate was quite focused on immigration and made that one of the points of Brexit, the single market was sort of taken off the table, I think, too quickly. Nevertheless, we are where we are, and so something like Canada's trade deal with the European Union, I think, is the desired end state, although something much more significant than that. And after all, you have to remember, Britain and the European Union have been aligned for many, many years now. So you're starting in a very unique position. We have pretty much complete regulatory alignment. We don't have tariffs at present. So we don't have big interest groups who are against free trade between Britain and the EU. This should be a relatively simple deal to conclude, although, of course, politics messes everything up.
It's not going to be simple. George, as you pointed out earlier on, there's no unanimity in the British Conservative Party. That's the ruling party in Britain right now. There are divisions there. There are members in the House of Commons, Conservative members in the House of Commons, who want a vote on any final Brexit deal that the government signs. Is that effectively a veto that they want? They could basically dismiss any deal in the future.
Well, it's certainly effectively a veto, because whatever deal she comes up with, I mean, they'll say, look, it's still up to British Parliament to have the final say. Now, there are those within the party who urge that Britain becomes some kind of a Hong Kong or Singapore of Europe, whereby it dismantles many of its regulations, and so it becomes this kind of a hub of capitalist development and entrepreneurship. I think that's very unlikely. I just don't see that Britain has any prospect of that, of achieving any of that. But it is a significant part of the Conservative Party. So that's why, given the divergence of views within the party, that it's not at all impossible that that there could be some kind of a complete breakdown within the party, and there is no deal. And there's no deal, and there's no deal, and then therefore, ultimately, Britain remains. I mean, it's just by de facto that there's nothing else to do, but everything just continues as before.
Bidisha, here's something a bit confusing that I read about the withdrawal of Britain from the European Union, and that is something called the EU Withdrawal Bill, which is in the British Parliament right now. It's been tabled, and if passed, it would mean that Britain would no longer be subject to European Union laws or regulations But at the same time, that bill calls for those regulations to be copied into UK law. Why would Britain want to copy UK laws into its own statute books?
It's exactly as the previous speaker said, it's symbolic. So, you know, international, including European laws on social justice, human rights, due process in the case of large criminal cases, the kinds of values we all share, we still do share them. But this very strange thing happened, which is that David Cameron in 2016, in June, threw out a plebiscite, an opinion poll, to appease the hard Eurosceptics in his own party. And half the country voted one way, half the country voted another way. And because of that, apparently, the people have spoken and we have to do it. So all these farcical Plan B situations are arising, whereby we're essentially copying and pasting the laws that we were all rubbing together along with very, very well, simply to say that we've done it. I absolutely agree with what the two previous speakers have said about the almost comical level of splits and divisions within the main parties in the UK as a result of Brexit, because not just the Conservatives, but also Labour are very divided on this issue, and there are all kinds of unholy alliances. So, for example, on the traditionally Conservative side, you have bankers, business owners. They are Tories because they are against high taxation, but they are also very international. And so they would want to be part of the international market so they can do their business. On the left, you have fervent socialists, apparently progressive, very egalitarian, but also at the same time insular, small-minded. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has been comically silent on Brexit. And so we're in a strange state of apparently different parties holding individuals who have very similar views. And that's why we're in a state of absolute stasis. And I agree also with the previous comments about the EU, about Tusk and Barnier and Juncker. They're not playing hardball with us. They're saying, okay, guys, you said you wanted to leave. You're determined to see this through. And they're essentially tapping their watches and saying, look, this is not a battle. This is a matter of sorting out legislation to leave the EU, if that's what you wanted to do. And there is no cancellation fee. This is not a divorce. The money that the UK is going to have to pay is to continue to pay, for example, the pensions of British EU staff that it had promised to pay. So it's a very strange situation.